I'm learning to fly around the clouds. But what goes up must come down.
Hello, thank you for joining us for Aviation Adventures. I'm Matthew Elia, the Operations Manager and a Flight Instructor for King Aviation-Mansfield right here at the Mansfield Airport. Today, I have joined me a very special guest. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Michael Sloan, who is a flight instructor as well as an author. And I have known Michael since 2005 when he was a professor of mine over at Bridgewater State, then college, now university. So thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
So before we talk about writing and aviation, you are a flight instructor. So how did you get started in flying? How did you make that interest a reality?
I've always been interested in aviation. My folks used to have a house that was on the glide slope into then Idlewild, now Kennedy Airport, and headlights of the planes would light up my bedroom at nighttime. And I always wondered about, what are those things? I had a chance to fly on a DC-7 from New York out to California when I was 8 years old. So I date back a ways. But my actual involvement came about accidentally when I was in my late 20s.
So did you just show up at the airport one day, decide it was something you wanted to do, or was it that chance happening?
That's a good question. I showed up at the airport on dates. I would take, when I was in college, I would take dates out to Kennedy Airport. It was an exciting place. You could go right onto the airplanes without a ticket. You just go up to the gate agent and say, wow. And they take you on and show it to you and show you the cockpit, and the flight crew would talk to you. You could go up to the control tower. They had observation decks. And I was fascinated with this, not to mention the fact that it was an inexpensive date. But my own professional involvement happened when I was 28. I was a contract education officer at Fort Devens here in Massachusetts.
Okay.
And one of my jobs was to poll the GIs on the post and find out, what would you like to see here? What types of courses? And one kind of course they wanted was a private pilot ground school. So I arranged to have a flight instructor from a local airport come and teach the ground school. But because I was professionally responsible, I monitored the course. And in monitoring the course, I thought, whoa, this is interesting. Never knew all this. I was entitled to be in the Fort Devens Flying Club. So I thought I would try out my newfound knowledge.
Interesting.
So I stumbled into it by accident.
Wow, that's great. I've never known that. So besides being a good date, how has flying or having earned a pilot's license once you got that chance start there, how has that benefited you?
A lot of ways. It benefits from the fact that there are very specific and defined challenges that any learner pilot faces. And in accomplishing those things, it's very specific, it's very measurable. It's part of SMART goals, attainable, realistic, within a time frame. And it brings you an appreciation and understanding of the world that we live in as nothing else that I've ever come across. It's going to snow tonight and tomorrow. So it brings up the question, why is it cold in the wintertime? Pilots have to know why. Why does my car get better gas mileage in the summer than in the winter? Pilots have to know that about airplanes. How do nor'easters happen, like the blizzards we've had? Pilots have to know why. So if nothing else, in learning the information to satisfy the federal aviation requirements, you come to appreciate the world in a way you've never thought of before learning to fly.
I think that's completely true. One of the things that I think is so important, I always try and stress with my students, and I'm sure based on what you just explained you have as well, is the challenges. It gives you a great sense of accomplishment as you meet those goals, and you're able to keep advancing through the flying.
And I like the idea that no airplane was ever landed by a committee. You bounce it in, It's your fault. You grease it on, you did it.
I think that's a great explanation. So what about outside of flying? How has flying, or having learned to fly, benefited you outside of aviation itself?
I don't know if you would consider Bridgewater State as the outside of aviation, but certainly I owe the job I have now to my aviation background. But beyond that, when I was assistant manager at a flight school at an airport north of Boston, it gave me a sense of community involvement, that I could make facilities at the airport available to various groups in the community. I got to know those people, their concerns, their interests, and how the airport was able to satisfy them. So it really plugged me into community that way.
Excellent. And I think we see the same thing here at Mansfield. We have a specific room, and a lot of the groups, we encourage the groups to come in and use it, the Boy Scouts, different political committees, different garden groups, and we always try and get them involved, and it really does bring the community to the airport, which I think is important.
Exactly.
So I know that in addition to being a professor and being a flight instructor, that you do some writing. And one of the main reasons why you're here tonight is because of your second book that I had the pleasure of reading, Cone of Silence.
Sure.
But before we talk about how being a flight instructor really helped you write a book, what other writing have you done?
Over the years, I've written a number of magazine and newspaper articles, predominantly with an aviation theme. Not always, but as I say, for the most part. And so I have an experience. I minored in English in college. I always liked writing, contributing written things to periodicals when I was in college. And after that, having articles placed in newspapers and magazines. It's a real rush to see the byline, you know, by Michael Sloan.
I can completely agree with you. The first time I had an aviation article published, it was really cool to see by Matthew Elia in the magazine.
I read that one, and it was very well put together.
Thank you. So specifically with writing, would you say that having learned to fly, any of the skills that you developed there, helped you as a writer as well?
Well, it certainly did with the novel that I had published, because it gave a backdrop to the story. It also gave me a focus as far as where the writing was going. Writing for pilots, writing about pilots, writing about pilot destinations. So it gave a kind of direction to my writing.
Sure. So the book is obviously, well, I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but it centers around, as you've said, a flight school, and uses a lot of the experiences that we're used to at the local airport. And I was particularly fond of the descriptions of the restaurants. Airport restaurants are almost all the same, but they're usually good, quick food. Good food, quick food, something along those lines, right? So how did the book come about? How did that start? Was that something that you always wanted to do, or was it another thing that happened by chance?
It happened by chance. Well, it happened by chance, and yet you know what Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. So there I was, stuck between flights at Philadelphia International Airport, flying commercially, and I had 4 hours. This is right about the time of the Great Recession in June of 2009.
Okay.
And besides complaining about the recession, there I was at an airport, and the two things just came together. I said, wow, what about a story about the problems we're having in the country financially, economically right now, affecting so many people, but having an aviation backdrop for it? And I started to think further, and I realized that my own experience was not with major airports like Philly or Boston Logan. It was at smaller airports, hometown airports, that people didn't know much about. I mean, we all know airlines fly at big airports, and military flies out of military airfields like Otis or Westover. And those small airports behind the chain link fences, nobody knows what goes on there. Well, this is kind of an entree. This takes people on a tour. and shows them, hey, this is what's going on out there. This is what's available to you if you're interested. And I thought putting the two together would be a sell.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I could tell reading it, one of the things that kept me enthused was the detail about the flight schools. Obviously, you know, I help manage the flight school here in Mansfield, and I was reading through it and saying, oh, I've seen characters like that either in Mansfield or in other places. And so I thought that was, you know, really exciting. So as we talked about, I've done some magazine writing like you have. I've never written a book, and we call this Aviation Adventures. It seems to me that writing a book is an adventure all its own. So what's it like to actually write the book? You told us how it came about, but how long did it take? What was that adventure like?
Fair questions. I would have to say that I approach writing in a slightly different way than a number of my friends or people I'm familiar with. I don't sit down at the keyboard and start writing. What I did at Philly Airport that day was I roughed out the plot, a synopsis. Where would I want a story to go? What kinds of major things would I want to have happen? And then when I got back home from the short trip that I was on, by then I knew, well, these are the kinds of characters that I would have to put in the book. So I created a matrix. What's the name of the main male character? What does he look like? What is he like? Just whether it's people you know that it's modeled after, or movie actors, television and screen stars. So I could say the main male character looks like my Uncle Fred, but his personality is like Angelina Jolie. It doesn't matter that it's cross-gender or anything like that. You're just trying to rough out the character. Does he like coffee? Does he take it with cream? In other words, a really good book is about what happens to people. And you need to know the people. Once I had that, I knew from the synopsis where I wanted the book to go, my true north. And I backed off and I said, okay, if this is how I want it to end, how do I want it to begin? What's chapter 1? Who's going to be in it? What time of day is it going to happen? What plot devices are going to be going on? Where is this going? And then chapter 2, and then chapter 3. So that if in chapter 4, my hero has to be a kung fu expert, maybe I want to mention it back in chapter 1 or chapter 2, so I'm not springing it on the reader at the moment I need it.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, something that I learned from a professor back at Bridgewater many years ago was to always do a lot of research and be prepared. I don't know who that might have been. But so in doing a little bit of research about your book and before you joined us today, I looked into some of the reviews, and I even posted a review about my reading of the book, and I found that, like my review, a lot of them, actually almost all of them, were very positive, very good reviews. So do you think, or do you believe that your intimate knowledge of aviation and how a flight school works are what led to those great reviews of your writing?
No, I don't think so. Well, maybe I could have said yes, but I think aviation gave it a realistic setting because I'm familiar with it. But I think what brought about from what I saw of those reviews online, I think a lot of it were people reacting to the reality of the book. The characters were real, the concerns were real, the circumstances in which the country found itself at that time were real. And this is a little kind of back-patting, I realize, but an important feature of any novel to me is that the characters grow because of the experiences that they have in the book, that they're not identical to what they started out as. And you can, I like to think, you can see some of the characters change, their viewpoints, their understandings, their worldview as the story progresses.
I would tend to agree, and I think that might have been something along the lines of what I wrote. So in this book, Cone of Silence, it's centered around a flight school. We won't give away the plot. But did you find yourself having to do research on the other topics? You mentioned the economy and the state of the country, and there were some other pieces. It wasn't all about aviation. So did you have to do additional research on those areas that you didn't have as deep a knowledge on to write this book?
That's correct. That I had to make myself, if not an expert, then at least